It's a warm June afternoon in 1999, and an eerie silence hangs inside the cluttered London home of David Screaming Lord Sutch. His fiancée pushes open the door to find a macabre tableau worthy of his own horror stage show. Memorabilia and leopard print costumes lie strewn about. On the staircase, a gaudy child's skipping rope has become part of a sickening scene. For a moment, she thinks it must be a prank. Screaming Lord Sutch was, after all, a lifelong joker prone to morbid stunts. But this was no act. The shock rocker, who spent decades bathing in fake blood and laughter, had orchestrated one final grisly scene, this time for real. Friends would later realise that there were warning signs he kept hidden behind the top hat and jester's grin. But on that day, the curtain fell on one of rock's wildest and saddest lives. Welcome to Rock and Roll Mysteries. David Edward Sutch was born on November 10th, 1940, in Hampstead, North London, as the Blitz entered its second month and the city's skies were a hellscape of fire and flame. Tragedy struck early, and the war was at its root. When David was just 10 months old, his father, William, a war reserve policeman, died in a blackout motorcycle accident. From that point, David was raised alone by his mother, Annie Sutch, in straitened circumstances. Mother and son shared a tiny flat in post-war Kilburn, scraping by on Annie's wages as a cleaner and shop clerk. Despite the hardship, Annie instilled in David a love of stories and performance. A fan of Charles Dickens, she named her boy after the hero of David Copperfield. Perhaps she sensed that her own son's life would hold a touch of the theatrical, and David indeed showed a flair for showmanship from a young age. He staged puppet shows as a child and delighted in entertaining others whenever he could. By his teens, young Dave was tall, restless, and utterly captivated by the new explosion of rock and roll. He listened avidly to smuggled American sounds on Radio Luxembourg, since the stodgy BBC offered little beyond big band fare. In 1957, he saw Bill Haley and his Comets perform in Brixton and felt the electricity of rock music pulsing in his veins, right from the source. But the path from gawky London teenager to rock star was hardly obvious. Sutch left the school at 16 and cycled through odd jobs. He was a sheet metal worker, plumber's apprentice and a garage hand. But he was nurturing dreams of the stage. He also began dabbling in political activism. In March 1958, the 17-year-old joined the famous Aldermaston March for nuclear disarmament, trudging alongside peace activists from the Atomic Weapons Facility to London. It was an early sign of the anti-establishment streak that would later define him. Sutch's entry into showbiz came as rock fever hit London's coffee bars. He haunted the Ace Cafe in Wembley on his sputtering Vespa scooter and made pilgrimages to Soho's Two Eyes Coffee Bar, the legendary skiffle and rock haunt where stars like Tommy Steele, Cliff Richard and Billy Fury had made their start. In 1959, Dave Sutch auditioned at the Two Eyes as an Elvis Presley imitator, but found himself lost in a sea of Elvis lookalikes. Rather than give up, he decided to try something wild. If he couldn't outsing the competition, he would outshock them. Spotting a pair of buffalo horns for sale in a second-hand shop, Sutch glued them to a motorcycle helmet and tore up his aunt's leopard skin coat to create a primitive, caveman meets demon meets Viking costume. He let his dark hair grow out to a then scandalous 18 inches, which he dyed under a tall top hat in public to avoid stares. Well, maybe to at least reduce the stares a bit. Transformed into what he dubbed the Wild Man of Borneo look, Sutch returned to the Two Eyes. This time, he made an almighty impression. A startled talent scout saw the horned loon screaming and howling on stage and recognized raw novelty when he saw it. "You've got a different approach. You want to make a record?" the scout asked in the straightforward manner of the time. With that invitation, Sutch's outright persona proved its worth. Now, a quick stop to remind you all that I have some fantastic and completely unique t-shirt designs available at the Rock and Roll Mysteries store. There's everyone from Graham Parsons to Brian Jones to Marianne Faithfull. They're made from very nice quality cotton and come in a whole range of sizes and colours. Have a look at the store at the link on screen now and down in the description. there's still time to grab a few Christmas gifts for your music-loving friends and family. And every sale is a massive help when it comes to the cost of running this channel. So thank you all very much. All right, let's get back to the rise of Sutch. In early 1960, having reinvented himself as a rock and roll madman, Dave Sutch set about assembling a band to back his act. A chance meeting in a Sudbury coffee bar brought him together with Carlo Little, a drummer fresh out of the army. They decided to form a group, initially an instrumental combo, but a fateful night at the Oldfield Hotel in Greenford changed the plan. Sutch hopped on the dance floor during another band set and started whipping his long hair wildly, screaming at the top of his lungs in excitement to the music. He caused such a stir that Carlo Little realised Dave Sutch himself needed to be front and centre as lead screamer. Thus was born Screaming Lord Sutch and the Savages. This was certainly an appropriate moniker that Sutch dreamed up, although it was in fact partly inspired by the Shadows' hit Apache and their later tune, The Savage. Adopting the tongue-in-cheek aristocratic title, Screaming Lord Sutch, 3rd Earl of Harrow, the young showman leaned fully into theatrical outrage and aristocratic oddball exotica. He had no real connection to nobility, of course. The self-granted title poked fun at the British class system, and the top hat gave him a marvellous Dickensian tilt. The screaming part, however, was quite literal. By his own admission, Sutch wasn't much of a singer, so he compensated with blood-curdling shrieks and comic horror lyrics. In the era of clean-cut crooners and tame pop, he was determined to be the freakiest creature in UK rock and roll. By mid-1961, Sutch's gimmick caught the attention of an equally eccentric figure on the music scene, independent producer Joe Meek. Meek was famous for crafting spacey pop hits in his home studio. His burbling space surf instrumental, Telstar, had been the first British-produced song to hit #1 in America. One night at the Two Eyes, Meek saw the wild man Sutch, quote, screaming and yelling, running around in buffalo haunts and my auntie's leopard skin coat, as Sutch later recalled. Meek, a horror aficionado himself, was impressed. Under Meek's guidance, Sutch began recording a string of delirious novelty rock singles. His debut 45 in 1961 was Till the Following Night, a ghoulish romp originally titled Good Golly Miss Molly Till the Following Night, complete with werewolf howls. It was no chart hit, but it established Sutch's niche in the nascent genre of shock rock. In 1963, Meek produced Sutch's most famous song, Jack the Ripper, a macabre garage rock stomper that would become Sutch's signature tune and stage centerpiece. And what a tune it was. If you have never had the pleasure, get your stomping boots on and go have a listen. I'll put a link down below. Around this grisly anthem, Sutch built an entire horror stage act. The act was, of course, very much inspired by the great Screaming Jay Hawkins. But Sutch's shtick was part homage and part Victorian London Gothic madness, all of his own making. Here's how it unfolded. In a smoky beat club circa 1963, the crowd waits in uneasy anticipation as a black draped coffin is carried onto the stage. The lights drop. Suddenly, the coffin lid crashes open and out leaps Screaming Lord Sutch, a banshee in a tattered frock coat, his face ghostly white with black-rimmed eyes. He brandishes a dagger and prowls the stage to the opening riff of Jack the Ripper. A scantily clad actress playing a Victorian prostitute flees in mock terror across the dance floor. Sutch gives chase, howling like a demon, and when he catches his prey, he proceeds to enact a gleefully grotesque murder, fake blood and entrails spilling as the audience screams in delight and revulsion. For the finale, Sutch hurls wriggling live maggots and mealworms into the audience, where they land in the hairdos and décolletage of unsuspecting young ladies. Chaos erupts. Girls shriek and faint, some from fright, some for fun, and pint glasses topple as the crowd surges back from the stage. In that premiere, nothing could match this spectacle for sheer shock value. Sutch had essentially created Britain's first proto-punk horror show and kicked off the now ubiquitous Ripper Tour shows that trail around London's East End to this day. It was like Madame Tussauds Chamber of Horrors come to life, only the waxworks start blasting out rocking garage tunes. Fantastic stuff. That outrageous stage persona made Sutch a cult sensation on the live circuit. His band, the Savages, became notorious for their opening stunt of charging through the audience in caveman garb, clearing a path for their lord to emerge from his coffin. Young musicians were eager to join the mayhem, and Sutch's early 60s lineups became a veritable nursery of future rock stars. Guitar heroes like Ritchie Blackmore, later of Deep Purple, and Jimmy Page, ace drummer Carlo Little, and keyboard whiz Nicky Hopkins all did stints in the Savages. The revolving door of talent only added to his underground legend. Despite the buzz, mainstream success perhaps unsurprisingly eluded Sutch's records. His blood-soaked singles included raucous novelty gems like Dracula's Daughter and All Black and Hairy. But they were too far out for BBC Radio, and none became chart hits. By 1963, the Beatles and the Merseybeat boom had swept aside London's fringe rockers with an altogether more palatable and well-behaved approach. So, Screaming Lord Sutch was famous without being famous, a recognisable figure in his top hat and leopard skin but with no hit song to his name. But he found another way to keep the spotlight from dimming, one that had nothing to do with record sales. In late 1963, British politics was shaken by the infamous Profumo scandal. While this one goes deep into Cold War conspiracy, it boils down to a cabinet minister named John Profumo's salacious affair with a woman named Christine Keeler. This wasn't only a bit of British sexual squeamishness, although the fact Profumo was a Tory didn't help on this front, but also that Keeler was sleeping with a high-ranking Soviet naval attaché, which caused a media frenzy about the potential national security risk posed by the pillow talk. I'll probably do an episode on Christine Keeler over on my other channel, Society Mysteries, in the near future, so be sure to join me over there too if you want to hear that one. Meanwhile, Profumo resigned, and this led to a by-election in his constituency, Stratford-upon-Avon. Seeing an opening for mischief and publicity, the 22-year-old Sutch decided to run for Parliament. It was an outrageous idea, a rock and roll singer with long hair standing for office in an era when politicians wore grey suits and sober ties. Styling himself as the candidate of the so-called National Teenage Party, Sutch cobbled together a platform that mixed genuine youth issues with a bit of cheeky satire. He campaigned for lowering the voting age from 21 to 18, since he'd met married teenagers unable to vote, a situation he found absurd. He advocated for commercial radio in Britain to break the BBC monopoly, and indeed founded his own pirate station, Radio Sutch, broadcasting rock music from a rusty fort in the Thames estuary. He proposed abolishing the punitive dog licence fee and scrapping the 11-plus school exam that rigidly tracked kids' futures at age 11. And of course, he threw in some wacky promises for good measure. He demanded a memorial college of rock and roll to honour British pop heroes, and even wanted a programme of enforced birth control, this last one presumably rather in jest. On election day in Stratford, Sutch rolled up in full costume regalia, top hat, hair down to his shoulders, looking like a psychedelic Victorian undertaker. Against all expectations, he didn't come in dead last. Sutch scored 208 votes. This was paltry by normal standards, but remarkable for an independent prankster candidate. More importantly, the stunt made headlines. Screaming Lord Sutch was suddenly nationally known as the rebellious troubadour of British politics. As he later bragged, "I've stood against every Prime Minister since then. Wilson, Heath, even the dragon herself, Maggie Thatcher." He earned the dubious honour of being treated like, to quote him, vermin from another planet by serious politicians. Sutch revelled in the absurdity of it all. Thatcher was a rising star of the Conservative Party in 1963 and did not take kindly to what she saw as a debasement of political propriety. Although this was perhaps surprising as she had some loony demands herself, not least of which was her early 60s attempt to reintroduce birching, that is being spanked on the bare arse with a stick, as a form of legal judicial corporal punishment in Britain. Anyway, when Sutch was asked about his relationship with Thatcher, he said, "She talked down to me. I think she's got Union Jack knickers," which was a typically irreverent Sutchism that ridiculed rather than insulted. So the rock and roll lord had stumbled onto a brilliant second act for his career. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, Whenever his musical fortunes waned, he could be relied on to pop up at elections, grinning for the cameras with outlandish campaign pledges. At one point, he promised to pave the streets in number-coded colours to simplify driving and to move the actual Houses of Parliament to the countryside on wheels. In an era of stuffy politics, his campaigns were a great joke, yet there was always a question of whether Sutch himself was fully in on the joke. He clearly relished the limelight and the opportunity to tweak the establishment's nose. The public, especially young voters, found him a refreshing splash of colour amid the dreary party apparatchiks. But Sutch had a dark side, a depressive sense that the country was losing its way, and that he was too. Even as he chased votes by day, Sutch continued performing by night. By the mid-1960s, he was a fixture on the UK and European rock circuit, infamous for carrying his coffin prop from London to Hamburg. In 1964, he even starred in a short promotional film called Lord Sutch and His Heavy Friends, prancing through graveyards in full ghoul makeup. He crossed paths with virtually every notable rocker of the era. This was a trend that started early in his career. In fact, in one legendary stint at Hamburg's Star Club in the early 60s, Screaming Lord Sutch and the Savages headlined, while an up-and-coming group called the Beatles served as their opening act. Hard to believe it now, Sutch later laughed, recalling how the young Fab Four toiled for hours each night while he and his band only played a 45-minute set for higher pay. Sutch tried to crack the American market too. In the late 60s, he hopped on a patriotic Backing Britain goodwill tour across the States, towing a Union Jack-painted trailer full of odd British merchandise like Sherlock Holmes outfits and flares with the Union flag on them. He performed at department stores by day, plugging British fashions and music, and rocked club gigs by night. Though he never scored the hit that would make him a star in the US, he befriended members of the Los Angeles music scene, like legendary groupie-turned-promoter Rodney Bingenheimer and provocateur Kim Fowley. If you want to hear a bit more about Fowley, I've got an episode on him. It's a good one. So, Sutch was perpetually on the move, chasing fame on both sides of the Atlantic with manic energy. By 1970, Screaming Lord Sutch's name was familiar to most Brits, even if more as a pop culture oddball than a recording artist. That year, he made an attempt to leverage his connections and finally score a hit album. Lord Sutch and Heavy Friends, released in 1970, gathered an astonishing roster of rock luminaries to back Sutch in the studio. Jimmy Page and John Bonham of Led Zeppelin, guitar god Jeff Beck, drummer Keith Moon of The Who, Noel Redding from Jimi Hendrix's band. They all lent their talents to the project in one way or another. It seemed like a can't-miss formula, but when the album dropped, critics were aghast. Without a strong voice or songwriting to match the heavy hitters, the record was a chaotic mess. Rolling Stone declared Sutch's vocals absolutely terrible and lamented that the all-star band sounded like a fouled parody of themselves. In a 1998 BBC poll, Lord Sutch and Heavy Friends was even voted the worst album of all time, which was a bit rich coming from the era of Peter Andre and Hansen. Still, even at the time, many of the embarrassed contributors disowned it. Sutch wasn't deterred. He even recorded a follow-up album, Hands of Jack the Ripper, in 1972 with some of the same crew, including Ritchie Blackmore and a faithful Keith Moon. But the damage was done. He remained a musical curiosity rather than a credible recording star. As the 1970s wore on, Sutch found himself drifting through what he later called his wilderness years. The British music scene moved on to glam, prog and punk, while Sutch's shtick seemed frozen in a kitschy time warp. He headed to America for fresh touring opportunities. In California and the Southwest, he gigged at small clubs where his British notoriety meant little. He was just another travelling act, doing his fire-breathing, coffin-opening number for puzzled bikers and barflies. Yet it was during one US sojourn that Sutch found love of a sort. In the early 70s, he met Fan Rendesi, also referred to as Than Quantrill in some accounts, an attractive model. The two had a passionate fling that resulted in Sutch's only child, a son named Tristan, born in 1975. However, domestic life was never on the cards for the perpetually roaming showman. Sutch and Fan's relationship did not last. She and Tristan remained in the United States, while Sutch resumed his nomadic life back in Britain and on the road. Fatherhood from afar did little to help. He continued chasing any gig or publicity stunt that could pay the bills. Indeed, income was a constant struggle. Sutch never stopped performing, but as the years went by, he often found himself returning to the bread and butter of political capers to generate headlines and appearance fees. In 1981, he formally founded the official monster Raving Loony Party. This was an outgrowth of the frivolous party he'd been personifying since the 60s. Under Prime Minister Thatcher's government, Sutch's zany presence became a fixture of British elections. He turned up at countless by-elections and general elections through the 80s, resplendent in his trademark top hat, leopard print suit, and often clutching a rubber chicken prop to underscore the silliness. Behind the clowning, he had a shrewd sense of how to exploit Britain's electoral rules for maximum theatre. He would deliberately run against big-name politicians, knowing the TV cameras would zoom in on the vote count and capture him grinning next to the likes of Thatcher or Harold Wilson. His notoriety only grew. In the 1983 general election, Sutch stood against Margaret Thatcher in Finchley. In 1987, he ran against Liberal leader David Steel. In 1992, against Prime Minister John Major. Sutch jokingly advised the colourless Major to adopt a Buddy Holly persona and get a Stratocaster to liven up his image. These campaigns were never about winning office, as Sutch lost his £500 deposit every time, but they were about what he called publicity, my favourite word. And publicity he got. He became Britain's most famous perennial candidate, contesting over 40 elections by the end of his life. He even holds the dubious honour of being the longest-serving party leader, despite never winning a seat. It was a career move that made him a household name, an institution as British as beans on toast and the Queen Mother. Occasionally, the joke had real bite. In 1990, Sutch stood in the Bootle by-election and received 418 votes, which was more than the candidate of the official Social Democratic Party, a venerable, if dwindling, political party. The SDP's humiliation at being beaten by a raving loony hastened that party's collapse shortly thereafter. Sutch took gleeful credit. "It took me and my party to polish it off," he crowed, noting that SDP leader Dr. David Owen was soon kicked upstairs to the House of Lords while, quote, "I'm still waiting for his thank you letter." In such moments, the clown prankster accidentally became a catalyst for genuine political change. Even the Prime Minister's office grudgingly acknowledged his impact. After Sutch's death, a Downing Street spokesman noted that, I quote, "For many years he made a unique contribution to British politics. Our elections will never be quite the same without him." While British youth knew Sutch as the perennial loony candidate, the rock world was quietly coming around to appreciate his pioneer status. By the late 70s, a new generation of musicians saw Sutch for what he was, a godfather of theatrical rock, an unsung influence on punk and goth. As punk rock exploded in London, Sutch was right there on the scene. In fact, the Sex Pistols opened for Screaming Lord Sutch at a few early gigs around 1976. Sutch had known the Pistols' future manager, Malcolm McLaren, back when McLaren was a young tailor making teddy boy suits. Some of Sutch's own stage suits came from McLaren and Vivienne Westwood's shop. He recognised the Pistols' anarchic energy, though he soon regretted letting them support him. Johnny Rotten and Sid Vicious took to smashing Sutch's PA system when the crowd booed their noisy sets, prompting Sutch to kick them off the tour after they'd destroyed half his equipment. Still, he admired their spirit. "It was very wild and very back to street level," he said of punk's rise, noting approvingly the two fingers up to authority attitude. Other acolytes emerged. The Damned, one of Britain's first goth-tinged punk bands, were open in their love for Sutch's horror shtick. Their vampire-loving singer, Dave Vanian, clearly took cues from Sutch's cape and coffin routine. Sutch joined forces with the Damned for some joint concerts, even letting them incorporate his coffin and cage props into their show. He performed his classic Jack the Ripper and All Black and Hairy on stage with them for delighted fans. The Cramps, those American psychobilly torchbearers of camp horror, idolised Sutch as well. When they toured England, Lux Interior and Poison Ivy sought him out like a pilgrim visiting an elder. They said they were ardent fans of mine. They had all the albums and I signed them. Sutch reported proudly. After decades of being dismissed by the mainstream, Screaming Lord Sutch was finally being acknowledged as cool by the misfit children of rock he helped inspire. "I'm known as the grandfather of punk now," he liked to say. Sutch never stopped gigging. Through the 80s and 90s, he remained a fixture on the retro rock circuit, often appearing at rock and roll revival shows or biker rallies where his old 60s peers performed. In 1992, at age 51, he even played the massive London Rock and Roll show at Wembley Stadium, sharing the bill with legends like Little Richard, Bo Diddley, and Jerry Lee Lewis. A photo from that event shows Sutch beaming in his Union Jack frock coat amid a who's who of rock pioneers. This was truly a testament to the odd place he occupied, respected as an entertaining relic if not for musical prowess. Sutch accepted his lot with good humour. He knew he was considered a novelty, but he embraced the longevity that novelty had granted him. "I'm like an evergreen, you know. You keep going and going," he said. And he did keep going, faithfully dragging out the rubber bats, skulls and flame-spewing hats for anyone who would watch, year after year. Publicly, Lord Sutch was the life of every party, a non-stop chatterbox with a gap-toothed grin, always ready with a gag. Privately, however, David Sutch was fighting off gathering shadows. Those close to him gradually became aware that beneath the jovial eccentricity lay genuine mental health struggles. In truth, Sutch had always been a mercurial character. Friends observed that he could be impulsive to the point of self-destruction and woefully disorganized in everyday life. One close comrade in the Loony party admitted Dave was a great bloke, but he couldn't organize a piss-up in a brewery. Sutch might drive hundreds of miles to the wrong town for a campaign because he misread the location. He was constantly late or AWOL. Indeed, the Loonies twice held their annual conference with Sutch failing to show up entirely. His personal relationships were equally chaotic. Rather than confront conflicts, Sutch would simply disappear. Cynthia Payne, a friend and famed former brothel keeper, recalled how Sutch's long-suffering mother, quote, was at her wit's end with him. When he was at his mother's, he'd say, "I'm just going out to get some milk," and then he'd be gone 2 weeks. He would similarly ghost girlfriends instead of breaking up, leaving emotional wreckage in his wake. Payne took pity on both mother and son, at one point inviting Sutch to live in her South London home, on and off for 2 years in the late 80s. She didn't charge him rent. The truth was she enjoyed his zany company, despite the headaches. Everybody loved him, she said simply. Beneath the lovable rogue exterior, though, Sutch was starting to lose a grip on himself. At times, he hinted at the exhaustion behind the clown mask. In the late 80s, his ex-girlfriend Valerie Bird once found him in a rare moment of doubt as he geared up for yet another campaign. He said, "I can't face doing this election." I told him, "Come on now, this is what you're known for. You can do it," Bird recounted. And Sutch did soldier on, saying afterwards that he thought of her encouragement the whole time on the hustings. It was an illuminating glimpse, the perennial loony candidate weighed down by the very role that sustained him. In truth, David Sutch was by then grappling with clinical depression, a condition he kept largely secret. Those closest to him suspected he suffered from bipolar disorder. In hindsight, the signs were all around. Sutch would have periods of frenetic, reckless activity, manic spending sprees on bizarre trinkets and cars he didn't need. He once bought a vintage Rolls-Royce hearse from an undertaker, a massive black land yacht that he painted with Union Jack flags and fitted with leopard skin seats. It matched his image, but he barely drove it, although it did feature on one of his album covers. Over the years, he amassed a collection of vehicles he seldom used, from a 1950s Cadillac to a Morris Minor, simply because in a burst of enthusiasm, each had struck his fancy. Likewise, he couldn't resist knickknacks. Market stalls knew him as the eccentric who'd buy any old whimsical object. He'd emerge with armloads of toy parrots, silly costumes and odd antiques. Often he gave these things away to friends shortly thereafter, spreading little gifts around, as if to buy affection or stave off loneliness. One friend recalled Sutch showing up with leopard skin slippers as a present, or bringing stuffed animals for the kids at a mate's birthday party. Generous, yes, but also symptomatic of a man desperately trying to spark joy around him while tamping down inner demons. Then there were the long sleepless nights. Tales of Sutch staying up all night, talking to friends and fans, and drinking endless tea are well known. Indeed, he was renowned for not touching alcohol. Tea was his preferred brew, yet he often looked bleary-eyed and hungover due to chronic insomnia. He'd phone friends at 3 a.m. just to chat, or binge-watch horror videos until dawn, the lurid imagery perhaps feeding his dark moods. Come afternoon, he might finally wander out, dishevelled and groggy. The high-energy public appearances were powered by sheer will and a showman's adrenaline. In private, he unravelled. By the early 1990s, Sutch was feeling increasingly trapped by the monster he'd created. Screaming Lord Sutch had become an unstoppable persona that devoured the quieter Dave Sutch inside. "I can't believe how big this has got. I can't believe it," he would tell close friends in moments of frankness. The official monster Raving Loony party had taken on a life of its own, and Sutch confessed anxiety that some freak electoral fluke might actually land him in Parliament. He joked about his ultimate nightmare of waking up as Prime Minister one day, forced to live out the Loony act for real. Under the humour lay genuine fear. After decades of playing the clown, did he even remember how to be himself? Financial pressures exacerbated his stress. In 1992, Sutch made an ill-advised purchase of a large house in Hastings, his own Premier's residence which he dubbed My Checkers, while still owning a home in Wembley. The property market promptly crashed, leaving him unable to sell the first house. He ended up nearly £200,000 in debt and verging on bankruptcy. Friends like Payne implored him to be sensible, to no avail. Somehow he muddled through, taking every paid gig he could get and leaning on pals when necessary. By the mid-1990s, he had resolved the worst of the debts, but the anxiety never fully lifted. The beginning of the end for Sutch can be traced to one personal loss, the death of his beloved mother, Annie, in April 1997. She was 80 and had been in declining health after a bad hip fracture. David doted on his mum. He halted his political campaigning entirely in 1997 to care for her, dropping plans to run against Tony Blair in the election so he could visit Annie daily in the hospital. "Ever since she fell, I've had my mind on her and can't concentrate on politics," he explained at the time. Her passing, on the eve of that 1997 general election, devastated him. Sutch arranged a characteristically outrageous send-off, a full Loony Party funeral at St. Paul's Church in South Harrow, with attendees in leopard print and top hats to celebrate Annie's life. But after the carnival came the loneliness. Sutch was now without his lifelong rock, the one person who had always seen David, not Lord Sutch. In the 2 years after Annie's death, friends saw a marked change. The ever-present spark in Sutch's eyes dimmed. He continued performing and politicking, but something was missing. He dropped hints of the side he was planning, one friend later said, noting with hindsight that Sutch's trademark gallows humour had taken on a more literal edge. Perhaps as a form of self-therapy, Sutch even sketched out his ideal funeral in writing, requesting a mahogany coffin with gold handles, a horse-drawn coach with purple curtains, even a TV and telephone in the coffin so he could, quote, "call my bank manager and my solicitor to make my will," from beyond. The morbid fantasy was pure Sutch absurdity, but it also suggests he was contemplating his mortality. Still on the surface, he kept up appearances as the jaunty Loony leader. In early 1999, he was celebrating 30 years of his fringe party's existence and making optimistic plans. He told friends he wanted to start a monster Raving Loony branch in Cyprus, even mused about staging a spectacular Halloween show in Las Vegas later that year. He had gotten engaged to his girlfriend Yvonne Elwood, a teacher 17 years his junior, and spoke of marrying her in Vegas as well. By all accounts, Yvonne was a stabilising presence. They split their time between her home in Reading and Sutch's cluttered house in Harrow. Yvonne later said David hadn't seemed severely depressed in his final days. In fact, some around him thought he was turning a corner. The finances were sorted out. He was sober, engaged and staying active. Yet the melancholy kept seeping through the cracks. On April 1st, 1999, Sutch played a gig at a pub in Hammersmith and invited Payne to attend. She noticed he was acting oddly, even by his standards. During the show, he gave her an impromptu peck on the cheek, as much as to say, "Thanks for coming," or "Goodbye," Payne recalled. When she casually said, "See you soon," Sutch responded with a sarcastic look that implied the opposite. It was uncharacteristic and it haunted Payne later. In May 1999, a series of small blows seemed to push him further down. The government hiked the required deposit for candidates in European elections to £5,000, an exorbitant sum that forced the cash-strapped Loony party to bow out of the upcoming Euro vote. "It's a bad day for the Loonies, a sad day for democracy," Sutch lamented to the press, betraying real disappointment. Shortly after, he attended the 50th birthday party of his longtime friend Rockin' Dave, aka Dave Roberts, and arrived late with bags of gifts, trying to be his usual Santa-like self. But his pals noticed he looked a bit down. That very day, his beloved Yorkshire Terrier Rosie had died. Days later, Sutch called Dave Roberts in a rare moment of emotional candour. Yvonne was away. He had just buried little Rosie in the garden, and he needed to talk to somebody. Roberts comforted him as best he could. Before hanging up, he told Sutch, "I love you to death. You're like a dad to me." Sutch seemed touched, replying that he was chuffed to hear it. In early June 1999, Sutch mustered his strength for a few final public appearances. On June 10th, he made a cameo at a Rolling Stones fan convention in Brixton, and even belted out his standby number, Roll Over Beethoven, on stage with Carlo Little's All-Stars band. But he was under the weather and only managed one song before coughing off stage, unusually subdued. On June 13th, he went to a 60s nostalgia concert in Hayes, West London. Old mates like the Tornadoes and singer Jess Conrad were playing. Sutch, normally unable to resist a spotlight, did not perform at all. He sat quietly at the side of the stage in shabby clothes, looking very ordinary and withdrawn. That image of the once flamboyant Lord Sutch appearing as just a tired, sad 58-year-old man sent a chill through those who saw him. In the early afternoon of June 16, 1999, an unsettling stillness enveloped the little house on Parkfield Road in Harrow. Yvonne Elwood, just returned from a trip, sensed something off as she steps inside. The place was a chaotic museum of Sutch's life, posters peeling off the walls, old skull props on the mantel, piles of unsorted papers and costumes everywhere. Calling out "Dave" yielded no answer. As she moved through the dim hallway, she gasped at a ghastly sight on the staircase. There was her fiancé, hanging from a banister by a multicoloured kid's skipping rope, eyes closed, face calm. For one surreal second, she imagined it might be one of his twisted practical jokes, the ultimate gotcha. He'd always been a prankster. But reality set in with a horrible weight. Screaming Lord Sutch, the fearless prankster who filled decades with laughter and shrieks, had taken his own life in a manner grimly echoing the horror he loved to stage. On a bed upstairs, he had carefully laid out the flamboyant stage outfit he wished to be buried in. A grey Regency tailcoat with a yellow silk flower in the lapel, his final costume. Nearby, scribbled on a calendar, are the last words he chose to leave the world. Depression, depression, depression is too much. In a notebook, he drew a self-caricature in full Loony party attire, circling it and scrawling the caption, "Loony victim." After 58 years of wild ups and downs, David Sutch could no longer bear the downward swings. His death sent Britain reeling for a moment. Tributes poured in from ordinary fans, fellow musicians, and even politicians who admitted a fondness for the old gadfly. At Sutch's funeral on June 28, 1999, Loonies, bikers, punks and peers gathered at the same Harrow church, where Annie had been memorialised. They sent him off in style. Roll Over Beethoven blasted through the church speakers, and wreaths shaped like giant top hats and teapots adorned his grave. True to his wishes, he was buried in the plot next to his mother, reunited in death. If he was alive, he would have enjoyed it, said one friend at the rock and roll wake. In the end, Screaming Lord Sutch got the splashy, irreverent funeral he'd fantasized about. He lived and died as a true original, a bundle of contradictions wrapped in leopard print. Perhaps the most fitting tribute came from ordinary Brits who had never bought his records or voted for him, but who nonetheless felt a strange affection for Sutch's perpetual presence in public life. In the days after his death, the sentiment echoed that the country had lost its greatest comedy politician. It was as if a little bit of colour had drained out of the national picture. Yet behind the act was a real person of depth, humour, and ultimately pain. That dichotomy, the horror and the humour, the bravado and the vulnerability, makes his story uniquely compelling. As he used to say, vote for insanity, you know it makes sense. And though his own tale ended in tragedy, the laughter and pandemonium he gave us will echo for a good while yet in the grand, unruly theatre of rock and roll. Alright, this was an interesting one. I love the Screaming Lord, but the deep sadness behind the Joker is one of the oldest tales. Let's all drink to the tears of a clown, as the Kinks sang. Could have been about Sutch. Well, if you're not British and of a certain vintage, you might not know much about Sutch, but I recommend checking him out, especially those Joe Meek recordings. Anyway, be sure to leave me a comment or two. I've been Chester, have a good one, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.